So I don't want to bore your time because we do have like a really cool panel lined up, but I wanted to give you at least a flavor. Well, first off, how many of you, this is your first Hyperledger meetup? I'd imagine most? Okay. So open source communities are like Soylent Green. They're made of people. This is LA. You all know movies, so you should get the reference. If not, go to Netflix. Is Soylent Green on Netflix? I don't know. But find this movie, Soylent Green. But it's made of community, and it's made of people. And the only way that these open source communities actually work is not by hundreds of anonymous random people just throwing code into a giant pod, and through raw Brownian motion it just organizes itself into killer software. No, it instead requires people who meet each other face to face often, who work together online in very open and transparent ways, who recognize each other's strengths, who kind of are cool with each other's weaknesses, right? But who really realize that they have common cause, right? And if anything, both Apache, when we started it, and really the Linux Foundation now, was based on this notion that these communities aren't organized around charity, right? There's certainly devs and companies who participate because of this sense that, well, this feels like the right thing to do, to give back. We're getting all this free stuff, then we kind of are obligated to put a little bit back upstream into making the frameworks we build on top of better, right? But for a lot of companies to get involved and individual developers, it's this kind of collective self-interest, right? This recognition that what we could build together is bigger and better than what any of us could do on our own. And a recognition that in software, in the technology space, things tend to be built in layers. And you can either build on top of a layer that is owned by a single vendor, and kind of where they call the shots, where they kind of determine what goes on. Or it can be built on a layer that is built by a community of developers. And when you do that, you might make it boring. Like, I've been accused of making blockchain boring. And I go, yeah, blockchain is kind of, like, if we get this right, this should be infrastructure. This should be like roads and bridges. And the last thing you really want are like exciting roads and bridges, right? Or an exciting water main, or an exciting power distribution box, right? Like, you kind of want this stuff to just work, but you want it to be improved on a continual basis. It's noteworthy that the Linux kernel, which was first, I think, released by Linus Torvalds, and he was a college student at University of Tampere in Finland, as like a first draft in early September of 1990, shoot, now I'm forgetting, 91, I think. So yeah, that's right, 91, because it's just about 27 years old, right? Who is using software anymore from 1991, right? The Linux kernel, though, continues to see development. It continued to grow. It continues to be in everything from cell phones to all 500 of the top 500 supercomputers on the planet. And it still sees today, every day, 10,000 new lines of code, 5,000 lines removed, and 2,000 lines changed. And this is what infrastructure software looks like. And this is what, Apache isn't that many lines of code as a web server, because the web server is just this kind of thin layer. But across open source, you see examples of these things that most of the world hopefully just gets to take for granted. But for those of you who are working on projects that get a little bit closer to the bone, a little bit closer to the foundation, the ability to look below that layer from time to time, to fix that bug, to add that feature, or to get to know the people who built that and where it's going next, is critical to your ability to build something cool today and something cool in a year. So that's what, broadly stated, the Linux Foundation does. And you see it in projects like Hyperledger. You see it like in this one we just launched called the Academy Software Foundation, which was done in partnership with the Academy of Motion Pictures, Arts and Sciences, to work with Disney and work with, which includes Pixar and all those others, to work with Intel and NVIDIA, to work with all these film studios and software makers to do common software around the production of a digital film, right? We're doing this now in the energy sector, something called LF Energy. We're doing it in the telco sector with all this software-defined networking and cool stuff that's going on there. And at the end of the day, it's all pretty boring, because at the end of the day, you should just be able to enjoy a great Pixar movie or know that your phone call connects through. But it's the gremlins that run the internet, the gremlins that run the infrastructure, who work together to build this kind of software. So that's why Hyperledger exists. That's why all of you, you're welcome to use the code. You don't owe us a dime. hopefully if you find a bug, you feel like reporting it. If you have a question, there's a community there to try to help you answer that question. If it's a dumb question, it might not be answered. If it's a smart question, it probably will be. It's why there's also companies like Altoros that can help train you up, that can provide support, that can put things together for you. In fact, we believe that when it comes to building these open source communities, it's not good enough to just write the code. You have to also simultaneously build a commercial ecosystem on top of that code. Because if there's no one on top of that code getting value out of using that and selling products and services on top of that, and I'm not saying like Red Hat, the only model is Red Hat or anything. It's like you can use these technologies deep in companies like Airbus and Daimler and FedEx and these other companies that are members of Hyperledger. But you need that sense of value coming out of that framework so that those companies think about investing that back in. Again, it's not charity, it's enlightened self-interest, right? And so we at Hyperledger, I've got half my team is focused on how do we get kind of the developers, none of whom we pay, all of whom come from the community, to work together effectively. And then the other half is really how do we grow the ecosystem of users and of companies around that. And hopefully that comes out in what you all see. So, but bringing it back to this, our hope is with each of these kind of meetup communities that we do, and we have now active meetup communities in over 100 different cities around the world, like 30 in China alone, that you all form a community, that you all kind of get to know each other, get to talk about the projects you're working on, that once a month, hopefully, you come together here or some other place and talk about what's working, talk about what's not working, because there's a lot that's not working, and what you discovered and what cool stuff is happening on the outside. And then some of you will get together and do a company, some of you will get together and want to work on a new consensus mechanism for Fabric, whatever. But the important thing is making that connection and making it personal. So that's why we're here, and that's all I really wanted to say. But I guess since I'm here, I'm happy to answer a question or two about Hyperledger if anyone has one. Yes.
So are all the frameworks, which one's the most popular?
The one that I've probably seen the most usage out there is Fabric. Now, Fabric was one of the two that started, Fabric and Sawtooth, which are different from each other in ways that we're still trying to figure out how to characterize. There's definitely low-level technical details, and they're different in the same way that MySQL and Cassandra are different, like a SQL database and a NoSQL database. But they definitely compete, but they're also sharing ideas with each other, right? And with the other frameworks as well. It's almost like a Darwinian competition. It's kind of fun. But Fabric is the one that's been most widely deployed, and it benefits from the fact that IBM has been selling it to a lot of their customers because they've been contributing a lot into it and making it their standard, really, for all of their engagements. But it now has also folks at Oracle and Huawei and several other companies, Blockdaemon and others, kind of providing hosting and infrastructure for it and making it kind of turnkey. And a lot of companies that have been doing consulting around it and made it a part of it. That is an interesting consideration for you all to think about in terms of where do you start with your investigation. But I don't want you to interpret that as, well, Fabric's the only one I should pay attention to, right? Because not only do we have some that are as generalized as Fabric is in Sawtooth, but Burrow being an implementation of the Ethereum VM and giving you the chance to be able to run Ethereum smart contracts on a permissioned ledger is also pretty interesting. If that comes up in your use cases and is something that you like. And then I'm really hopeful that in the long run, the biggest impact we'll have on society from the use of blockchain technology is on identity. And so Hyperledger Indy, for us, is this kind of long-term moonshot kind of play in kind of getting us out of this mainframe kind of style world with Facebook and Twitter, where your identity and your profile and your personal data is all on the other end of a login and password in Mark Zuckerberg's hands or someone else's hands, right? And instead, so much of that is more local to you in the form of you put your hands around in the form of a wallet, and it's attestations, it's documents, it's basically things that will survive even if Mark decided he wanted to delete you off the internet, or the school that you went to disappears, from the planet. You'd still be able to prove I have a diploma from there or I have a health record from there. This is called self-sovereign identity, and so this is behind Hyperledger Indy. And I went way beyond your question, I'm sorry. Fabric is cool though, and Fabric has a lot of users around it now, about 40 production networks. And it's mature enough that you can use it for a huge number of the use cases that people are looking at for blockchain tracking. Yeah.
Permissioned versus permissionless. Does Hyperledger have a view on that? Is there?
Sure. So the question was permission versus permissionless. And before, I mean, I can talk for an hour on that, so I'll try to avoid that. But there's a door in this room, right? And that door creates kind of this boundary of like, we're here, we're in this, we're part of this community. And you know, the door is pretty open here, but you kind of had to fill out a form, your name on a form on a website to get on that list that the guy was at the door was tracking, right? And even though that, you know, anybody could get on that list, there was still kind of an agreement that we're here for a purpose and a reason, right? And so most of the communities I've been a part of have had some sort of boundary, as trivial as it is, that helps define who's in the community. And frankly, that helps us get to know each other better. So in the blockchain world, you have one of the starkest differences is between networks, like blockchain networks that are comprised of members who are in a community who identify with each other. And they probably all agree when they walk in that door and sit here and start talking and transacting with each other on not just a common technology to use, like which protocol, which standards, and how do we update that, but probably also a governance mechanism. How do we make decisions about when to upgrade, when to deal with a bug that allowed me to steal Greg's assets, right? And you know, do we do something that forces me to have to give Greg back his assets, even though I was following the rules, it just there happened to be a bug in the rules, right? But for many people, any governance mechanism like that is an invitation to tyranny. Sorry, is an invitation to abuse, right? And I can totally sympathize with that point of view as well. And a lot of where the Bitcoin and Ethereum world came from was this point of view that said there should be no doors. Everybody should be able to participate. Somebody should be able to walk in and buy a Bitcoin from somebody or otherwise register on the network. And that's a beautiful vision, right? And the question I think that we face is, where is that gray area between the two? Like, how easy can we make it to walk in that door and participate in the network? Because the easier we make it, the bigger the network can be, the more participants, that's great. But we also realize that you know, governance still matters, the ability to recover from bugs still matters. So where Hyperledger has typically focused, and partly it was because, you know, before I joined, my boss, Jim Zemlin, who was starting to field requests from companies to check out doing something in the blockchain space, said, you know, there's a lot of underlying value to the blockchain layer that is independent of the cryptocurrency side of the world. And maybe that deserves its own place, right? Maybe that deserves kind of a place to work these ideas out, build a community, see if there's something to it. And if it turned out there wasn't, no big deal. Failure happens all the time. And it turned out there is. There's a lot of value to being able to say, whether it's by avoiding a consensus mechanism called proof of work, which is very energy intensive, or and getting higher transaction rates because of that, or simply saying, you know, in banking, in medical records, and all these use cases, a fully public ledger would be really hard to swing. So we kind of explored the other end of that spectrum, you know, the permissioned ledger spectrum. At the end of the day, I think this is going to be a variable in a configuration file, right? That at the end of the day, we'll have a common body of technologies that can be deployed, whether this room is the size of 10 people or 10 billion. And there'll be different algorithms, different protocols used, but hopefully we can make these runtime configs rather than full philosophical differences. And in fact, I'm kind of positioning us away from the blockchain for business framework, which makes us sound like the USS Enterprise, you know, kind of like, and much more towards thinking of us as a place for blockchain technologies that are coin agnostic. If we come up with a zero knowledge proofs algorithm that works for Hyperledger Indy and for Fabric, and it's portable and it's a good implementation that's been vetted by a lot of cryptographers out there, why not see that used? Hope that could be used by Zcash or by Neo or by any of the other more public ledgers out there. So we'll see where that goes.
Can I just piggyback on that? For the enterprises, you'll see more permission-based than anything else, right? But you also foresee that it's going to be a hybrid world between permissionless, just that we have hybrid cloud today.
It'll be a hybrid world for sure, because the world is a hybrid of these different models, public and private. We have public newspapers that report on what happened on December 20th, 1969, and we can all go to the library and look in the microfiche and see 10, 20 different newspapers, right? And that'll be the same for other people elsewhere. And that's how we get to like a common reference of what happened in the world on that date, right? But there's a whole lot that wasn't published in newspapers that was private, but had its own constituencies, right? And so these things will coexist and scale because I think they're necessary. So I don't think Bitcoin or Ethereum are going away. Don't ask me for price or whether now is a good time to invest or not at all. I have no idea. I have a very small amount invested, and I'm down on that, as probably many people in here. So I take that what you will. But this underlying technology will be really valuable for you all to learn and get your hands on and get inside of, no matter what happens with a particular coin. And maybe one more question from somebody. I want to get a diverse voice if I can. I'll go with you.
Hi. Getting back to algorithms, do you know if Hyperledger is working with any schools for like in the math departments? Like
we are. I mean, so we are very lightly funded, right? So we don't have like researchers of our own to go out, but we've been partnering with a number of academic groups to try to say where there's research happening inside of a place like at USC or UCLA, because they have a blockchain society, or Berkeley actually has a pretty active blockchain in Berkeley group, or in Europe there's a whole bunch that have been active. How do we help them kind of figure out what are the interesting research topics, right? And how do they best take advantage of the community and what's already been built, right? And so very happy to be helpful on that front. We don't have grants to be able to make, but we might be able to find pathways that would really help us on that. Yeah, very good. So I don't want to take any more time from the panel. Thank you for indulging me, and I'll hang around here as long as I can.
Thanks, Ryan.